All right, so we're going to get started in a whole new unit, a whole new set of stuff to learn here in computer science this year. We're going to start talking about conditional expressions, which is actually something we learned a while ago when we were working with the Lego robots. And that's why we did the Lego robots at first, was to learn some of this stuff in advance. But now we're here in a little bit more of a complex language, and we're going to learn conditional expressions with Visual Basic instead of with the Legos. So here's some objectives for today. By the end of this, you should be able to explain where and why a conditional expression is used. In other words, what does it do? Why would you want to use it? And you should also be able to use an if statement as a conditional expression, which is what a conditional expression is in Visual Basic. A quick announcement, and this is an important one. Don't forget that your vocabulary sheet is due on Wednesday. So all of the notes that you've been taking on vocabulary along the way, you're going to hand in that sheet to me on Wednesday. If you're behind on that, you should stop this lecture now and go back and get that done. All right, so here's the plan for today. We'll start with reviewing what conditional expressions are. Then we'll talk specifically about the if statement, which is a type of, it's the main type of conditional expression in Visual Basic. And then we'll do an example or two. So let's review. These slides, I've stolen these slides from our stuff with the robots from before, so you can remember how we learned it back then. Back then, we had only had our robots doing things in a row. The robot does this, that, right in a row. It does one thing, then the next, and then the next. And here it goes, doing one thing, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. Okay? But what a conditional expression does for us is it gives us an option, so we can make choices. So we can have the robot move, wait, turn, and then decide, hey, is it loud right now? And then go one way or the other. If it's yes, it is loud, do one thing. And if no, it's not loud, do the other. And so what conditional expressions do for us is they don't just make us do things one at a time, but instead they make it so that we can make choices in our code where some code is executed, we say conditionally, some code is executed based on a choice, based on the state of things. Okay, so that's what a conditional expression is. It's basically a choice inside the program. It makes it so that some code is executed or some code is not. And that, of course, has two parts, and we learned this back in the day. We have something called the condition, which is the thing that you test. It's the thing that, it's the question that you're asking. Okay, so for example, if our robot comes along and then asks, is it loud? Well, it's checking the condition of loudness. The condition is it loud right now? And then it has two separate code paths. That's the different sections of code that get executed based on the situation with the condition. So there are two paths for this one, maybe go and turn and make a sound, or maybe turn left and do something else. These different code paths are a result of the different conditions. So that's a big conditional expression. We have two things, the condition, which is a question that we ask, something that we test to decide which path to take, and the code paths are what things happen as a result of the answer of that condition, that question. So how do we do this in Visual Basic? What does a conditional expression look like for us there? Or how would it manifest itself? So let's say you have a little simple program that has a label that says, who is the best teacher in the world? And a text box for your answer, and then you can click the button to see if the answer is right. Now the key for this is to see if the answer is right. Already we know how to press that button and make a message box come up. But what we don't know how to do quite yet is to make the message box come up only if the answer is correct. And for that, we're going to need a conditional expression. Let me show you what it looks like. So here's a subroutine for when you press that button. You can see it says private sub and end sub. For the button 1 click, that's the button that says check your answer. And when you click the button, let's say we have a couple of things happen. For starters, we declare a variable called answer, and then we take the stuff from the text box and put it in the answer variable. This basically stores the answer from the text box and puts it in a variable so we can play with it and do things with it, right? We've learned all last unit about how to do variables. And now we need to ask the question, after the code goes from declaring the variable, then filling the variable with something, we need to ask a question and say, hey, is the answer correct? And if it is correct, maybe we want a message box to come up that says you're right. However, if the answer is not correct, we don't want that you're right text box, message box that is, to appear at all. We want to skip over that piece of code. And so what a conditional expression does for us is it allows us to ask a question where we can say, okay, if the answer is right, then go ahead and do this. But if it isn't right, skip over that. We don't want to do that. And it allows some code to be executed or not executed based on a question, based on a condition. All right, so how do we do this in Visual Basic? We use something called an if statement. All right, so what is an if statement? And this is just a form of a simple conditional expression in Visual Basic. And it's called an if statement because we use the word if, I-F. And that actually makes sense because we're going to be testing a condition. If you were to say it out loud, you might say if. Okay, so for starters, when we're using a conditional expression, we type the word if. And then later on, there's going to be something right after the if, which we'll come back to in a second. Then we say then. And at the end of the whole conditional expression, we write down somewhere below end if. And that lets the computer say, all right, I'm done with my conditional stuff. Okay, but that's not quite it, because between the if and the then, we need something special. Okay, the reason why there's something there is because we say, okay, if something is true, then do something. Okay, so a conditional expression asks a question, and between then the if and the then goes the question itself. So we call that the condition. So we say if, and then we provide the computer with a condition that it can test, and if that condition is true, then it does the stuff right here between the if statement and the end if statement. Okay, so anything between those two lines of code will be executed if the condition is met. Now that's kind of confusing to say. Let me say it one more time. We start by typing if, then we write the condition, which is basically a question. We're asking the computer, is this true? And if it is true, then, that's why the word then is there, all of the code below that is executed until we reach the word end if. Okay, so let's see how this works in a real example. We'll go back to that example I had a second ago with the best teacher in the world. You've got this form that says, who's the best teacher in the world? And there's a text box right there and a button to check your answer. So the user comes in and they type something in the text box and then they hit check your answer and the code inside the button executes. And this is the code we're looking at here, button 1 click. So what do we do first? Well, this is what we did before. We'll take the stuff inside the text box and put it inside a variable. You see it says dim answer as string, which declares a variable. It leaves a little space that we can fill stuff in. We'll call that space answer, and we're filling in the stuff from the text box. We're putting it in a variable called answer. Now, we want to test to see whether this answer is correct, and then we want to have the user know that they've got it right. So here we go. We're going to start with an if statement. We say if, and then we of course always have the then and the end if. So what code do we want to execute if they do get the answer correct? We want to have a message box come up that says you're right. Okay, that just tells the user that they are right. And because we've put this message box between the if and end if, it will execute as long as the condition is met. Now we haven't specified the condition yet. We need to do that still. But if the user does get the answer right, then the message box will appear that says you're right. And if they don't get it right, then you won't see that box. Okay, well, what is the condition that we need to test here? We have if, and then we need something between there to test if the answer is right. Well, if the answer is right, then of course the user would have put in Caden as the best teacher in the world. So we can say if answer equals Caden, then display this message box. Okay, so this is a simple example. It says if, and then it tests to see if the answer is equal to Caden. The computer says, okay, the answer is Caden, then put the message box out there. However, if the answer is not Caden, if the user did not put Caden in the text box before, then anything between where it says if and end if will not be executed. Those lines of code will not be completed.